Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
BioShock is a critically acclaimed first-person shooter game released in 2007, which was developed by 2K Boston, later renamed to Irrational Games. BioShock is set in the fictional underwater city of Rapture, where the player enters the game during the climax of Rapture's civil war and tries to escape the city whilst learning about its past. Due to BioShock's popularity and financial success, the BioShock experience has been expanded with multiple sequels and spin-offs, including BioShock 2, BioShock Infinite, and the Burial at Sea expansion packs. BioShock was loved for its game mechanics, its engaging story, and its attention to detail. People who have played it will remember its Art Deco environments and its original characters, which was all set at the bottom of the Atlantic. While this game blends elements of survival horror, FPS shooters, and role-playing decisions, players were also exposed to complex intellectual commentaries and political ideas throughout their playthroughs, which are gaming elements that are rarely seen in modern games today. Many people were introduced to classical liberalism in their playthroughs of BioShock. For example, the sweat of the brow refers to the concept of natural rights and property rights, which are foundational principles related to capitalism. There are many similar themes expressed in the game, communicated through audio logs and radio messages that are found throughout the city. Ken Levine, the creative lead of Irrational Games, purposely based most of the themes of BioShock off of objectivism, a philosophy that was developed by Ayn Rand. She was a world-renowned philosopher of the 20th century, author of the books The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. The city of Rapture embodies much of the philosophy that Ayn Rand advocated for, favoring liberty, rationality, capitalism, and small, limited government above all else. Most of the character aspects of Andrew Ryan was based on the philosopher Rand herself, and so while most gamers might not be aware of the works of Ayn Rand and objectivism, if they have played this game, then they probably have an understanding of these themes indirectly. Because of this, BioShock stands as the only video game in popular culture that has introduced the core components of objectivism and classical liberalism into a gaming audience worldwide. But what exactly is the philosophy of Ayn Rand? How did her philosophy cause Rapture to fail? And what philosophical lessons can be learnt from this game and the fictional characters in it? This is Love, Life and Anarchy, and I'll be doing an in-depth presentation on the philosophy of BioShock.
What is the difference between a man and a parasite? A man builds, a parasite asks, where's my share? A man creates, a parasite says, what will the neighbors think? A man invents, a parasite says, watch out or you might tread on the toes of God.
Andrew Ryan is the main protagonist of BioShock, and the main outlet of objectivism in this game. He is described as an extremely successful American business tycoon that is a firm supporter of individual rights and free market principles. Being a self-made man, he held the conviction that men forged their own destiny and were responsible for their own path. Andrew Ryan shared many similarities to Ayn Rand's own life story. In fact, his name is an anagram of hers. Andrew Ryan was born in Minsk, Belarus, not far from Ayn Rand's birthplace of St. Petersburg in Russia, which both became a part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, after its revolution. Both Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand experienced the Russian Revolution, known as Red October, when the Bolsheviks got into power. The Bolsheviks were ideologically driven by socialist Marxist theory and became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in which they confiscated businesses and seized the means of production from the capitalist class. Both Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand discovered the horrors of totalitarian governments firsthand when their family's property and wealth were seized for the socialist state, and could only watch as their community fell deeper into despair. They fled to America in the 1920s, seeing it as a country of freedom and prosperity. The economic freedom that America embraced meant their intellect and determination was rewarded with wealth and prosperity from the free market. However, both Ryan and Rand saw how the US government was increasingly adopting socialist policies, such as Franklin Roosevelt's The New Deal, and feared America would eventually suffer the same fate as Russia. When Hiroshima was destroyed by the atomic bomb wielded by the same US government, Andrew Ryan saw that as the ultimate betrayal of his ideals and the death of his nation. The government had used the science and the wealth of others to create a weapon that could destroy anything they could not control. This is what finally motivated Andrew Ryan to found the City of Rapture, and secretly invited the world's best and brightest to retreat there with him. The backstory of Rapture was heavily inspired by Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. The book depicts a dystopian society sliding into economic destruction due to totalitarianism and excess government regulation. Industry leaders and entrepreneurs begin to disappear from society, leaving behind their businesses and capital investments. As new laws and regulations continue to strangle the industries of the world, vital services such as transport, food production, and energy services begin to decline or halt. We learn that the people who are responsible for these industries were encouraged to strike as a form of political protest against the government and the world that didn't appreciate them. They built a secret city known as Galt's Gulch, a free society made by people who value the ideas of freedom, liberty, and capitalism. Eventually, the government collapses on the outside world, and the industry leaders return from their hiding in Galt's Gulch to build a better world without the government's involvement. Both Galt's Gulch and Rapture were built on the ideas of objectivism, the name of the philosophy that originated from Ayn Rand. Objectivism is a guide to living a virtuous life based on reason. It starts with metaphysics. Objectivism states that reality exists, and it exists independently of us and our consciousness. That means we discover reality through our senses, not through faith or mysticism. As we discover and analyze the objective world around us, we use our mind's ability to reason to make sense of it. Through the unique human ability of using reason, we are able to make the objective world serve us, rather than the other way around. Commitment to reason and critical thinking leads to the rejection of religion, the supernatural, and anything else that cannot be empirically verified, favoring reality or reason above all else. This is why both Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand were atheists, who rejected the idea of God.
You don't approve of religion because?
Because it's mystical, because it's based on faith, not on reason and facts.
The objectivist view on happiness is based on the Aristotelian view on happiness. Aristotle argued that happiness comes from ourselves, and that it was based on rational self-interest and self-fulfillment. Aristotle argued that self-love was the highest form of love, and that self-love was needed for virtuous living. Because of this, serving other people's happiness can only come after serving your own happiness. Or said another way, saying "I love you" only has real meaning when you use the word I. This was later fleshed out in objectivism to ultimately reject altruism, which can be heard in some of Andrew Ryan's speeches. Altruism is defined as self-sacrifice being the highest form of moral value, that serving others is the only justification of existence, and that you have no right to exist for your own sake, but only exist for the needs of others. Both Ayn Rand and Andrew Ryan believed that most, if not all, evils of the world was due to people being manipulated by altruism and the emotional prejudices that altruism enables. That evil is enabled not by selfishness, but by wanting to serve others before yourself, and that the world would be a better place if people put their self-interest above self-sacrifice.
Whenever anyone wants others to do their work, they call upon their altruism. Never mind your own needs, they say. Think of the needs of the state, of the poor, of the army, of the king, of God. The list goes on and on. How many catastrophes were launched with the words, think of yourself? It's the king and country crowd who light the torch of destruction.
I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that man must sacrifice himself to others, which is the present-day morality.
Altruism is not to be confused with kindness, goodwill, or respect for others, but the rejection of oneself for the happiness of others. Giving to charity or helping others should be seen as something you want to do out of self-love, not something that you are forced to do out of self-sacrifice. There have been many variations of altruism throughout human history. Under religion, some of the followers of the faith are expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of God or for the good of church. Under the Soviet Socialist Republic, Russians were expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of the people. Under Roosevelt's New Deal, people were expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of the poor. And under many contemporary democratic nations, people are expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of social justice. The only differences in all of these examples is the question of who is to be sacrificed and to what cause. A free and rational society is one where man lives by his own mind. For his own sake, he neither sacrifices himself to others, nor sacrifices others to him. When the realities and values of objectivism are seen as priorities in society, it ultimately leads to a capitalistic environment, where the individual holds the right to property and trade in each of their hands, that their self-interest is preferenced above self-sacrifice, and that the role of government is limited to only protecting the rights and freedoms of others. This was the economic system that Rapture embraced, and the economic system that Ayn Rand advocated for. A totally laissez-faire, unregulated, uncontrolled capitalism. Citizens and business owners were expected to oversee and self-regulate themselves, without the involvement of governments. In real-world political terms, this is known as minarchism, and for a while it was wonderful. From 1946 to 1958, Rapture experienced tremendous economic progress, political stability, a culture of entrepreneurship, numerous business establishments, and unprecedented scientific advancements, just as Ryan predicted it would do. But that all changed once Frank Fontaine arrived in Rapture, and the city began to decline. Fontaine was a con man, a criminal mastermind, and the arch enemy of Andrew Ryan. He constantly undermined Rapture, Andrew Ryan, and the principles the city was founded on. After a long decade of sabotage and criminal activity, he eventually led a civil war against Andrew Ryan, which led to the destruction of Rapture and their way of life. So while the city of Rapture started as a principled objectivist society and its values was shared by the inhabitants, it fell into disarray after other characters started to work against Andrew Ryan and the principles of what Rapture was built on. But not all of this can be faulted on men such as Fontaine. Andrew Ryan himself abandoned his own principles when it came to governing Rapture, which ultimately led to its downfall. The first principle he violated was the idea of free trade. Respecting property rights and respecting people's freedom to trade is paramount to objectivism and classical liberalism. Andrew Ryan talks about a great chain of industry that unites people.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
Adam Smith, famous economist of the 18th century, coined the similar term the invisible hand. The invisible hand, much like the Great Chain, describes the unintended economic benefits of all individual actions within a community. Through the power of market forces and free men, the invisible hand guided society to help achieve its greatest outcomes, both morally and economically. But the invisible hand doesn't always serve in the interests of particular individuals, especially the individuals in power. Andrew Ryan felt the Great Chain move away from him when contraband started to appear in Rapture. Andrew Ryan prohibited trade with the outside world. The justification for doing so was to keep the existence of Rapture a secret, fearing governments would invade if they ever found out about Rapture. He delivered harsh penalties to smugglers who ignored the ban, arresting or even hanging them if they traded with the outside world. By limiting the supply of goods from the outside world, the Great Chain was pulled forcefully towards Andrew Ryan's direction. Ironically, this only created a greater demand for contraband, and thus the Great Chain was pulled back towards the people. This motivated Frank Fontaine to use his criminal skills and meet that demand through his smuggling ring. He earned the first of his riches through the black market this way. This kind of government interference is similar to how the government tries to control the war on drugs. When the government restricts trade on specific items that people want, such as drugs, they create a black market. The black market, through its artificially strong profit motive, attracts the more ruthless and dangerous people to fulfill that demand. Similar to the way Fontaine was drawn to it, these kind of smugglers, cartels, and mobsters are only around because the governments artificially created that environment for them to do business in. They could not exist as businesses if governments respected free trade and respected the rights of the individual. It is the government that created these black markets through their policies, and it was these policies that encouraged people like Fontaine to do business in them to fulfill that demand. Players can argue that Andrew Ryan was justified in restricting trade with the outside world, but players cannot argue that Andrew Ryan supported free trade or capitalism in principle from these policies. By restricting trade and banning certain goods from the outside world, he increased the power of his own government and interfered with the rights of the individual, something that Ayn Rand and free market economists do not advocate. While Fontaine became increasingly infamous and dangerous, Rapture's small government was constantly on the hunt for him. Fontaine knew he couldn't survive long this way, and so he faked his own death in a shootout between Rapture's police force and his own smuggling ring. He would create a new persona, named Atlas, to continue on with his endeavors. While Frank Fontaine's smuggling ring was in disarray, Andrew Ryan came in and nationalized Fontaine Futuristics. He seized Frank's assets, his Adam, his works on plasmids, the orphanage, and his charity groups for himself. This was done against the wishes of his own council. His inner circle encouraged Ryan to hand over Fontaine Futuristics to Atlas's group as a peace offering. Ryan refused, promising he'd break it up in due time. This created resentment in Ryan's inner circle and the inhabitants of Rapture, as Ryan was going against the core principles of what Rapture stood for. Atlas was able to exploit that policy against him, stirring up resentment and class struggle warfare against Andrew Ryan and the upper class, which would ultimately lead to Rapture's civil war. Rapture could not have survived the Civil War as it was, and so preventing the Civil War from happening would have been Rapture's best hope. This could have been done by following the principles of capitalism and allowing the citizens of Rapture to freely trade with the outside world. Doing so would not have created resentment in the citizens, and would not have given a large amount of resources to bad men. Power also corrupts. Andrew Ryan had complete power and control over Rapture and its inhabitants, as he built the city and enacted policies on its citizens. If it's true that power corrupts, then governments can only grow and become more corrupt, as Andrew Ryan's council did. This is why some classical liberals favor the elimination of governments over a limited one, arguing that limited governments will inevitably grow into a fascist one, as it did with Rapture, because power corrupts. These libertarians, known as anarcho-capitalists, disagree with the objectivist stance on small limited governments, and favor a free society without a central coercive power. One of their reasons is although a limited government could theoretically only exist to protect individual rights, there are ultimately no safeguards in place that could stop them if they wanted to expand their power. When a small limited government has the power of initiating force over its citizens, then there's no real way of controlling that. Atlas's goal was to control Rapture through exploiting the powers of Andrew Ryan's council. If Rapture truly was a free society, there would be no government for Atlas to overthrow, no government that could seize businesses and assets, and no government that hanged people for contraband. Protecting the rights of the individual from theft and fraud could have been done by the people in the city in a decentralized way, which is the kind of society anarcho-capitalists advocate for. When there are no agencies of centralized power, then there are no agencies that could become corrupt, and no agencies that people like Fontaine could take control over. The fictional city of Rapture did fall from grace into a dystopian nightmare, but the reasons for such cannot be blamed on objectivism, capitalism, or individualism. The fall of Rapture was due to the abandonment of those principles. Andrew Ryan allowed his small government to overstep their bounds. They regulated trade, seized assets, and killed people who disagreed with their policies, which are the very real dangers of government, and is what the life of Ayn Rand reflected on. Frank Fontaine manipulated the poor through brutality, lies, altruism, and plasmids to start a war with Andrew Ryan and the upper class. The splices of Rapture could not be reasoned with, and were guided by their own violent impulses or pheromones in the air. They had lost their free will. There is no society that can prevent its own collapse once rational people lose their minds the way the splices did. Ultimately, the fall of Rapture can't be faulted on Andrew Ryan or Frank Fontaine. It wasn't the splices or the plasmids or the big daddies or being under the ocean. At the end, what destroyed Rapture is the very real thing that threatens to destroy our world. It's what every rational philosopher informs us about. It was what Ayn Rand dedicated her life to warn us about. And it's what the characters of BioShock urged us about. At the end, the only thing that can end our world is the end of reason.
Every business has to have its own terms and its own kind of currency. And in love, the currency is virtue. You love people, not for what you do for them or what they do for you. You love them for the values, the virtues which they have achieved in their own character. You don't love causelessly. You don't love everybody indiscriminately. You love only those who deserve it.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
Look, Mr. Bubbles. It's an angel.
Symmetry, dear Steinman. It's time we did something about symmetry.
Rapture is a body, Delta. I am the voice. And Big Sister is the hand. When Rapture speaks of you, it says only this. Your day is done.
They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets.
I love Mr. Ryan, but I love Ratchet. If I have to kill one to save the other, so be it.
Andrew Ryan reminds us we all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us.